Thanks for joining me, Rick. Now, I'd like to focus our conversation today on the data and intelligence gathering. But first, I want to establish whether this balloon being in the U.S., was an accident. The Chinese side says it was blown off course. But to you, what is the probability that this was actually an accident?
Zero probability. According to some sources, the Chinese have launched 20 to 30 balloon missions similar to this one against many other countries over the last decade. In just the last 3 years, they've flown over Japan, the Philippines, Indian military bases in the Indian Ocean, and near the important missile test range of the United States on the Hawaiian island of Kauai. The path of the balloon over the United States is a certain indication that its main purpose was military surveillance and nuclear targeting.
I see. So based on past observation and how many times this has happened, there's no way that this was simply an accident.
Absolutely. And the Chinese Foreign Ministry cover story of about February 4, that it was a civilian weather balloon, is bad news in itself. A weather balloon such as this would be a complement to China's about 5 polar orbit weather satellites. Now, indeed, much of the data that would be gathered by the balloon could also be gathered by the satellites. But the important point is that the balloon provides redundancy. It provides a backup in the case the satellites are taken down. And the data obtained by the balloon would be of a much greater and finer category than that gathered by the satellites. The balloon would be much closer to the target, and it's very important to have data like temperature, wind speed, atmospheric density when you're targeting a very small nuclear warhead from the other side of the globe. The balloon would give the People's Liberation Army rocket force a higher degree of data upon which to far more accurately target their nuclear warheads. And it is an indication to me that China is quickly shifting its nuclear doctrine from one of broad deterrence, please don't shoot at us, to nuclear warfighting, meaning from the get-go, we're going to shoot nuclear weapons at you.
So from what I gather, you're saying it has data on temperature collection, nuclear information. What can China do with this kind of information that it has obtained from the U.S.?
Well, the weather data is important in order to allow the People's Liberation Army rocket force to put as fine a calculation on the missile's trajectory as possible. The correct trajectory determines how accurately you will hit your target, such as the missile silos that the balloon hovered over in Montana and in other places. That weather data would allow for far more accurate targeting, would allow for a first strike with much more confidence. It's actually quite destabilizing.
And, the balloon has since been shot down, but since the balloon has entered and being shot down, what kind of data do you think it has obtained within this period?
Well, as we saw at many points, the balloon had very clear weather. So any surveillance cameras, video cameras, would have had an easier time taking pictures and video data of these important American nuclear bases. And of course, the weather data feeds into the targeting, which allows China to consider whether it wants to strike first rather than simply use its nuclear weapons to deter strikes from others.
What do you think we can learn from the debris after we find it? What do you think we'll find?
Well, we will learn far more about the balloon and its surveillance payloads, but because the balloon travels far closer to its targets, these instruments are not going to be of have high power, uh, as opposed to instruments on satellites in space. So we're not going to learn as much from these instruments as we might learn and might want to know about China's low Earth orbit and deep space satellites.
You know, I've read that recent Chinese military research papers have said that these balloons can also test an enemy's air defense reaction time. Do you think that's a possibility?
Well, definitely. The Chinese Communist Party leadership was not just testing our air defense reaction time, they were testing our leaders. They were testing our chain of command. They were watching very closely to see how we organized our reaction, how quickly it would take for us to come to the decision to shoot down their balloon. And on that level, the Chinese Communist Party leadership learned a great deal about the potential for indecision and inaction by the American leadership, by the leadership of the Biden administration. And this was a very dangerous precedent to set by this administration.
I think the dilemma was, you know, Biden talked about this on Wednesday, wanting to shoot it down, but he wanted to wait until the balloon was over water before it was shot down. I think that was the dilemma. What are your comments on that?
The balloon should have been shot down before it crossed into Alaskan territory. And up there's water and lots of land and very few people. That's not an excuse. It's a poor excuse by President Biden. The only other reason not to have shot down the balloon is that our intelligence agencies convinced the president that they wanted to monitor the balloon and learn as much as possible about its mission, its capacity for maneuverability and hovering. So on that score, we were able to observe this Chinese intelligence asset closely and intimately before we shot it down. So we gained something from this exercise, even though the Chinese potentially have gained a very wrong impression about the willingness and ability and capacity of our top leaders to respond to their aggression.
And we had knowledge of where this balloon was the whole time, right?
Absolutely. It was monitored from when it crossed into American territory over Alaska, when it flew over Canada, and when it flew across the continental United States.
And as you mentioned before, it's not the first time that China has sent balloons into another country. What do you think this tells us about what China wants to do or its ambitions?
Well, the balloon campaign is a sort of a high altitude reflection of what China is already doing on the ground and at sea to most of its neighbors. It sails warships through and in between the Japanese islands and around the Japanese islands. It inundates the waters and air around Taiwan with warships and combat aircraft. It sends its Coast Guard ships to harass Indonesia, the Philippines. It even sent warships last year to sail off the coast of Australia in a military coercion mission. What the balloon mission tells us is that the Americans, the United States, will be similarly harassed. As soon as the Chinese Navy is large enough, has enough aircraft carriers, we will see them sailing up and down our Atlantic and Pacific coast. When China has enough long-range bombers, they'll be conducting patrols east of Hawaii And when China has bases in Central and or Latin America, it will deploy forces as well to harass the United States, just as it is already doing to many other countries.
And quickly, just one last thing. Do you expect President Biden to mention China in his State of the Union address?
I would certainly advise that he spend significant amount of time addressing the balloon incident and addressing the necessity for the United States to spend far more on defense and to become prepared far more rapidly for greater instances of Chinese aggression. The Chinese balloon reconnaissance mission directly contributed to China's ability to fight a nuclear war. The American people have to be told this in no uncertain terms, as well as our allies.
Thank you very much, Rick Fisher, Senior Fellow at the International Assessment and Strategy Center. Great having you on.
Thank you, sir.